I'm Emerson, also known as Steep T, and today we're going to be using Mod Podge, some contrast paints, and a hairdryer to make some pretty cool looking flesh bases. So let's get steeping and I'll show you the process. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is find a base. I started looking around and not quite settling on a size until I found a good medium-sized base, one that specifically had that inner lip. So now we need to mix some bone white from Vallejo and some Golem and Flesh contrast paint by Citadel together into the Mod Podge. What this is going to do is this is going to allow us to make sure that the Mod Podge doesn't dry clear and instead leaves behind what is going to hopefully make what looks like a very convincing amount of flesh. Additionally, you can use any colors that you want. In this case, I chose these two colors specifically because of the flesh that I was going for, but any flesh tone and any contrast paint would work for whatever you're trying to do in this situation. You can figure out what combination is going to look best for you, but in this case, I used 1 drop of Vallejo Bone White with 2 drops of Golem and Flesh in that ratio to about as much Mod Podge as I thought I was going to need for the base. You kind of just have to feel it out and see what's going to work best for you, but these are the numbers that I started with. Now that we've got our Mod Podge all mixed together, now comes the step where we actually have to brush it onto the base. There's 2 important aspects that you have to keep in mind while doing this process. The first is that you want to make sure you fill every edge, nook, and cranny with the Mod Podge, so that way when you're pulling on it in the next steps, you'll actually get some really good attraction to those edges and what looks like flesh. Additionally, you want to make sure you're using a pretty consistent amount, not overflowing on the base, of course, but not so much that it's a thin layer. You want kind of in the middle, so that way you've got enough Mod Podge to pull on and work with, and not too much you overflow or too little that you just kind of get a ball of Mod Podge right in the center. And so once you've got that all brushed on, we're ready to move on to the next step. So I used a brush the first time I did this process, and it more or less ruined the brush. Thankfully, this is just a $2 brush from Michaels, so it's not too big of a concern if it's ruined. But in this case, for the second run, I'm using, it's impossible to see, but it is a very, very thin piece of pinning wire that we're going to use to pull the Mod Podge across the surface. So now it comes time to actually start pulling the Mod Podge. And the way I accomplished this was first drying the surface of the Mod Podge and applying a continuous flow of air using a hairdryer. I put the settings on hot at first and I found that that was literally burning me while trying to do this. So I recommend using warm, but still making sure you've got a lot of air going. What's gonna happen is as you start to grab and pull the Mod Podge up, you should get a very tight stretching effect, similar to when you're like pulling on skin. If it's goopy or wet and just is falling apart, you don't have the right amount of either heat or air flowing over the surface of the Mod Podge. But as soon as you've got this nice thin skin, you can start by picking it up and moving it across the surface, touching it down to different points on the base. You're going to continue this process for a large number of overlaps with the flesh because that's what's going to build up our very complex, meaty, fleshy grossness that we're really looking for on this base. So you're just going to continue and continue and continue until you've got a complicated enough base that you're satisfied with it. After you've gotten that, give it a light dusting with air just to make sure that it's all locked down and isn't going to go anywhere for just a moment. And we're going to move on to now painting it up with our contrast paint. Now that we have our Mod Podge in place, we want to work quickly on this next step as time is kind of our enemy as soon as we're done using the hairdryer. So we started with Blood Angels Red. Yeah, that's the paint. Yep, that's the paint. And I'm very lightly allowing that to flow over the surface of the Mod Podge. You want to make sure you get every crevice, you want to make sure you get every fold, but you also want to ensure that you're not smushing it. So it should be just light enough to transfer the contrast paint to the surface of the Mod Podge, just like a wash. Making sure to fill everything in and get everything covered, but don't worry too much about any excess pooling. Those places where the original base is exposed end up looking really, really impressive once dried. Again, time is still our enemy as we enter the most critical part of this process. Mod Podge is still not dry, and as it continues to dry, the surface tension is going to take those folds and stretch them out and flatten out. So we need to make sure we take our contrast paint and lock in our colors immediately. So as soon as you've got your contrast paint all painted down, you're going to grab your hairdryer and you're going to start to dry the contrast paint. This is very unorthodox for how you're supposed to use contrast paint, but trust me, if you leave it on the model, all you get is this perfectly smooth surface with absolutely nothing interesting about it. So by drying it quickly, we make sure that even as the Mod Podge continues to tighten as it goes from regular glue to now cured resin and very tight and rock hard, we want to make sure that we keep that interesting texture and effect that we've gained. So that's the reasoning for why you want to use the hairdryer in this step. And what it's going to give you is a really crisp texture on this base. So now we have a really cool looking base. And it's important to note that the Mod Podge is white while dried, so this is the brightest that it's going to look. So if it's not bright enough, it's definitely not going to be bright enough when it's done. So I recommend going back and making another one or peeling off this current batch and starting over on the same base. But so far at the time of filming, it looks like it's going to take about 2 to 3 days to dry. And so we'll look at that after it's dried and see how it looks for its final effect. Hey everyone. Okay, so it's been like a week and a half. I got a haircut, so forgive the continuity break, but we've got our base. There we go. Look at that. Oh, it's gorgeous. But we made a mistake, which is interesting. And I'm gonna go over that first. We're gonna take a look at them as they're finished and then go into how we got there. This effect right here is very interesting. It ended up looking like a pizza, so honestly, I'm not super impressed with this one all around. But as you can see, the parts where the white pigment went, it didn't do what I thought it would. We have these bright colors where darkness should be and dark colors where brightness should be. And the whole thing, if we get the light to shine just right, is really smooth. And so to me, it just doesn't look very good. So now I'm going to show you the one that was actually successful. The trick was not adding the pigment to the underlying flesh where the red was. Instead, it's going to be adding the pigment to the flesh that we want to stretch across the top. So I'm going to show you what it looks like now, and then we're going to go over how we got there so you can see what a good end result looks like, at least one that I'm personally satisfied with. This one was dry brushed with the colors that pertained directly to the model that was based on it. And honestly, I think we got a really good marbled, sinewy look on the base, and so I'm honestly pretty impressed with how this looks. Like, the model all in all looks really nasty standing on this. So that's what we're gonna go over, is I'm gonna show you the process now that it's been a week and a half of how we achieved the maggot crown bone sacks base, because the others were kind of just not what I was looking for. And if you want to know how to do it, it's a similar process. Just add the pigmentation like we did, but it's important to go back. I'm not going to take it out because I think it's an important thing to understand where we were thinking and then where we are now. But in all seriousness, I wouldn't add the pigment. Letting it go straight through to the underlying color on the base, I think ended up having the best effect. As well as making sure that it doesn't smooth over and instead stays textured so you can actually dry brush it. So let's get into how we did that, and you'll see how I arrived at our final base. And I think you'll be really satisfied with it. I know I surely am, and it's been quite the journey. So let's get steeping on it, and you'll see in a moment. So the first step now with the cured base is to make sure that we dry brush it now with the exact flesh tone we used on, in this case, the model we're basing with it. In this case, we're going to be using Goblin Flesh Tone, and it's by War Paints, the Army Painter, and absolutely love the color. It's fantastic. We're just going to dry brush over the whole surface, make sure it's got lots of detail now showing up from that dry brushing. And after that, we're going to move on to dry brushing it with some of our red pigmentation, which in this case we used Gory Red by Vallejo. And so after we get the Gory Red on there, we took a moment just to take a little bit of the blood splattering paints and spritz that all over the base for a bit of texture. Once we've given everything an opportunity to dry, we're now going to follow the same process that we did initially with how we were placing the flesh on the base to now sort of stretch some skin across it and get a really gross, disgusting look. We start by doing that by mixing up the paint and the Mod Podge, just like we did before. In this case, we're going to use the same skin tone, which is our Kobold Flesh, and get that all mixed up well. It took me a while to realize this, and a huge thank you to everyone who was in chat at the time, because they're who gave me the idea, and I really agreed with them that in this case, less is more. You're gonna make it further with just a little bit of skin than the whole mess of skin that ends up turning the thing into a pizza. So the process is really similar. Using our small little wire piece, we're going to dot from location to location and start stretching out skin in a way that feels natural and gross and fleshy. And we're just looking to really try to sell the effect that there's skin involved with this model. So as we continue with this process, we're going to make sure it dries, and we're going to let it actually set and cure. After it's had the opportunity to set and cure, now comes the final step of dry brushing it with the same highlights we used, which in this case is the Vallejo Dead Flesh, and giving it a small wash with some cold gray. That way we have the whole color range that we do on the original model on now just this base. And it really helped marry the two together. It really, I think, sold the effect and made it feel like this monster was sitting on top of some really gross, disgusting, gory flesh. And all in all, I think that's just spectacular. I really can't believe how cool of a job it ended up turning out to be. And I learned a lot in the process, especially with Mod Podge and playing around with decorating a base like this. So now you can really see the final effect. The miniature here that we're looking at is the Maggot Crown Bone Sack by Reaper Miniatures. And I have to say, not only was this a really fun miniature to paint, but it worked really well for the idea that we had and that I was working with for this fleshy base. It really is, I think, really cool the way that it turned out. Looking at it as it goes around, I can't help but smile at this gross, nasty, beautiful thing that we've created. And so, I just want to say thank you. This is my first YouTube video, and I have no idea what's going to happen in the future. I plan to make a lot more videos. I've done a bunch of really cool things that I think warrant neat tutorials. And so, if you liked, please like, subscribe, ding the bell, and share with your friends. I stream on Twitch primarily on Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays at the time of this filming at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So feel free to come check me out on Twitch, and you can see the magic happen live and in real time, and we can just hang out and paint some beautiful miniatures together. So, as always, everyone, thank you so much for hanging out with me. Stay steeped, and I'll see you next time. Bye!